Good morning and welcome to Trinity Cathedral and the Trinity Forum. Greetings on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day. My name is VJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity Cathedral in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, and it's my great pleasure to welcome the Reverend Dr. Marvin McMickle. Dr. McMickle is the director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Colgate Rochester University. He's also the interim pastor of Antioch Baptist Church, where he had served before as the pastor. Now he's serving as the interim. And we're blessed to have him on King Day. He joined us yesterday as our preacher. And if you didn't join us, I encourage you. I would never say pause this interview now, but now's a perfectly fine time to go and watch or rewatch his homily from yesterday. Dr. McMickle, it is a great pleasure to have you here to be in conversation with us. And before we begin, I do want to offer a program note, and that is to remind folks that these forums, we pre-record them generally for technological reasons, but there are other reasons that we do, which means this was, here we are speaking today is actually Thursday morning, the day after a mob stormed the Capitol as the election of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris was to be certified. And so we were still in a state of sadness and shock at what we saw happen. So that's very much on our minds right now. But I also say that to say a lot may happen between now and the day where this interview airs, which means so much is on our minds and our hearts, and we're holding one another in prayer. And so, Dr. McMickle, I'd actually like to begin there to talk about what we witnessed yesterday and what is on your heart and what is on your mind having seen that.
I think that what we witnessed was as close to a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat, a political insurrection, an attempt to disrupt the transfer of power from one administration to another, as this country has ever seen. That thousands upon thousands upon thousands of persons would swarm onto the Capitol grounds, that hundreds of them would physically smash windows and break into the United States Capitol building, that some of them would have the audacity to parade Confederate battle flags through the chambers of the United States Congress, that several of them felt at liberty to sit at the desk where the president of the Senate presides and put their feet up. And others went into the office of the Speaker of the House of Representatives and leave her a note that says, "We will not back down." That was a shocking display of political insurrection. But the worst part, and I will say this for myself, I'm not linking anybody else's thoughts to this. The worst part was not that. The worst part was what precipitated that for me. It was the rally that they had been summoned to Washington to attend, saying, "Come to Washington on January the 6th to create trouble." And they came. And they were instructed to march on the Capitol by the President of the United States. Now, there's no denying this. You can't say, well, you're making that up. No, this is on national television. The only thing that wasn't a part of what the president said was, he said, "And I will march with you." Well, of course, he did not. He didn't go with them. He sent them, went back to the White House and watched on TV and said very little until he was forced to about what was going on. So I think our social fabric is becoming unwoven. Our sense of the United States of America is being challenged. And I think the real challenge for the incoming administration is to reconnect us, if they can, after the divisions, political divisions, social divisions, religious and theological divisions that have arisen in this country in recent times.
Mm. And you have spoken about a renewed tribalism, which I think there's a lot of layers to that word, to those two words put together. And I wonder what we today is King Day, as we remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, as well as we talk about John Lewis and his story. How where do we see the genesis of this renewed tribalism, or rather, where are we helping it along unwittingly, or where is it happening quite intentionally? And how do we address it with both love and hope, but also a sense of realism about how we respond to it and create something holier and healthier?
I wonder whether or not it has been here all along, but suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether or not at the end of slavery, for instance, 1865, and the emergence of African Americans as free citizens with the right to vote by the 15th Amendment in 1870, and the election of African Americans into political power, and the suppression by federal troops of those persons in the southern states who were trying to prevent Black people from exercising citizenship. And then with the end of Reconstruction, so now we're at 1876, 1877, when the federal troops left the South and the Klan arose, I wonder if something was unleashed then in terms of white supremacy and trying to suppress any challenge to white political dominance, white economic dominance, that we've never really been able to put back into the bottle. Mm-hmm. We've just suppressed it. We passed the Civil Rights Bill, 1964. We passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We thought maybe by the laws we had suppressed it, so that even if the racism, even if the bigotry had not physically gone away, it was sufficiently locked up that it would never be unleashed. I think what has happened in recent years, beginning, I think, in 2013, with the weakening of the Voting Rights Act. Prior to 2013, you could not make any changes to voting practices without getting the approval of the Department of Justice or federal judge. The Supreme Court struck down those provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And the next day, the day after those provisions were struck down, 10 states across the country immediately went into voter suppression practices. And now it seems as if there is one political party who thinks that it can only win elections, not if it earns votes, but if it suppresses votes. So I think we're looking at something that has a long history. The civil rights movement tried to keep it boxed in. Lyndon Johnson tried to suppress it. I think in recent years, it has received a legitimacy and authority and a social acceptability. It's acceptable to carry Confederate flags now. It's acceptable to suppress the Black vote. I say again, I think our social fabric is wearing thin.
Yeah.
And we've got to find a way to reknit it before the country explodes. Because Black people are not going back. There's no suppressing this. You know, Raphael Warnock won an election to the United States Senate 3 days ago We're not going back. I don't care what anybody says or does. So the idea that you can recapture some past when the United States Senate or any other part of American society could exclude people of color, Asian persons, Hispanic persons, African American persons, or an all male assembly. We're not going back to that. So those who want to go back are up against a fundamental roadblock. Nobody's going back. There's only one way forward. That's it. Forward. And we have to find a way to do this together, going forward, not back.
Absolutely. And what I loved in your homily was as you took on what is a very real phrase in our culture, which is "Make America Great Again," and you focused in on that word again. You know, the first three words in a vacuum are uncontroversial. We want that.
Sure.
We have all kinds of different ways of defining that and identifying that. But when you bring in that again, as you say so powerfully, what's that time that we're going back to?
Yeah.
Why exactly? What is it about that when we know objectively that there is no point in American history where there were not a vast amount of folks who were shut out of power, and in particular when we're talking about African Americans, where oppression and the reality of white supremacy was not something that was a lived reality. Is that what we want to go back to? And I think this is, of course, the very real question: is what are we saying when we're saying that? As we went through yesterday, in the terrible ways that we have those awful days, as news just popping at us through our phones or however we're doing it, which of course is a tragedy in its own right because it's so difficult to keep one's equilibrium in the midst of it. I was very grateful to you because in our conversation in preparation for this conversation, you had me take a look at John Meacham's book about John Lewis. His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. And forgive me for doing this now, but John Meacham is one of our favorite Episcopalians. So I've got to claim that.
Baptists.
I got to claim the good ones when I got one, and I do, and we certainly do for him. Having just read his chapters on Selma, and the story of what it meant for John Lewis, pushing against all kinds of tides, including within his own organization, to stand in front of mounted police as Confederate flags are flown, to endure physical beating and remain committed to love and nonviolence. Boy, that sure stood in stark relief to what I saw happening in the Capitol yesterday.
Yeah. That, I think, is the difference between aspiration to be able to live into the American promise and anxiety that some people have that their America, as they have known it, is getting away from them. This is the difference between saying, I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, Dr. King's 1963 speech in Washington. And those who think that that vision of black and white together and equal opportunity and all persons are created equal is an infringement on their liberty. This is my country. I was watching some 5, 6, 7 years ago, C-SPAN was covering one of the earliest Tea Party rallies. It was Arkansas Tea Party rally. And I guess they were organizing for some upcoming political event. And you know, on C-SPAN, there's no reporter that's with which you interact. They just cover it live. So they zeroed in on a woman who was saying from the floor of this convention with tears streaming down her face, "I want my America back." Over and over, like a lament, "I want my America back." Now, what does that mean? This event took place on the day after Barack Obama had appointed or nominated Sonia Sotomayor to the US Supreme Court. So an African-American president was appointing an Afro-Puerto Rican woman to the Supreme Court. And she wanted a country back where neither of those was possible. She didn't want an American Puerto Rican, born in America, but of Puerto Rican heritage. And she didn't want an African American president to be a part of her America. How do I get my America back? And I really think the election of Barack Obama unleashed something in this country. As wonderful as it was for me and for millions of people around this country and around the world, as wonderful as it was horrifying for others who could not imagine that an African American was the commander in chief, that the African American was the face of the United States. So what she was saying in that Tea Party rally was, this is not the country I want to live in. I want to go back. Here's the problem. That's precisely the country I want to live in, where power is equitably distributed and where anybody can aspire toward any office. And if you can win the election, you get to live at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and you get to appoint Supreme Court judges, until they began to say, no, you're going too far. So then here comes Mitch McConnell, who's now deciding, okay, you don't have the right to nominate any more judges. So we're going to block everybody that you want to nominate from now on. Here's a strange irony. On the same day that these folk were rampaging in the Capitol, Merrick Garland was nominated to be the Attorney General. Merrick Garland was the Supreme Court nominee that Barack Obama was proposing to the Senate following the death of Antonin Scalia. Mitch McConnell said, no, we're not going to even act on that. We'll let the next election decide who gets to make that designation. We're going to hold that from February until November. Then, when the current president had a vacancy to fill after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, while the campaign is going on, they made a nomination, which McConnell rushed right through, because they're trying to hold on to power and limit who gets to do what in this country. So I say again, and I say again, and I say again, the future of the United States of America was on the ballot. It was on display in the Capitol on yesterday. It is what's at risk in the coming 4 years. Will the people who invaded the Capitol recognize Joe Biden as president? Will they honor Kamala Harris as the vice president? Or will they say, this is not our president, we do not recognize a duly elected president? In which case, what are we going to do? Are we going to have a divided country? Are they going to generate a new Jefferson Davis? Are they going to secede from the Union? That's where we are. We're at a breaking point in our social contract. And we need not only civic values driven by the Declaration of Independence and by the US Constitution and by all the amendments thereto, we need spiritual values. We need to hear from the church. The church needs to hear from its leaders. The Episcopal Church is blessed by the presence, in my opinion, blessed by the presence of your presiding bishops. and his most recent book on the power and value of love. We need to keep hearing from him. And I think we're blessed on a global scale with the current Pope, who I think has a worldview that is vastly different than any of his predecessors. But it's not just those who operate at the national level and the global level. I think we have to check the heart of every pastor, every rector, every rabbi, every imam. We need spiritual values that are designed to enhance every human life and not use religion as a bludgeon by which we use the name of God to beat folks into line.
One of the gifts of Bishop Curry is he is able to speak to Episcopalians. He knows how to reach folks who maybe have a hard time getting out of the maybe either or. There's two sides to all things. And yet I always read his statements very carefully. Usually you want to get to the second paragraph or the third paragraph. There is something really deep just waiting to kind of explode on you in a good way, that's going to disrupt you. And so he went on air online and he very quickly named this as a coup.
Yeah.
And I was grateful for his witness and his naming what this was.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that reminds us, he also blends in this present moment civil and spiritual. But as I think about the story of John Lewis and spending time with Meacham's book, it was such a vivid reminder in times every bit as dark as this one, of the civil rights movement. It was a civic movement, but it was also very much a spiritual movement.
Yeah.
Rooted in sacrifice, rooted in, this was not zero-sum games. It was about John Lewis putting himself in the line of fire, and it was a higher order than simply recreating laws. And I was so moved by the reminder of the connection to Mahatma Gandhi, to Howard Thurman's trip to India, to Jim Lawson, thinking about Northeast Ohio, connecting all of this through a lens of something that we in the church would be very proud to spend time talking about and exploring. And so often it's hard for us to even have that language. It's hard for us, the term white supremacy is a very difficult term for us to name. And I would say in my own journey, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been reluctant to say that white supremacy was more than Bull Connor. And yet, as we read in the story of Congressman Lewis, the movement from Bull Connor to dealing with the whole reality of systematic internalized racism that is enforced through, there's really no better word than supremacy right now.
Yeah.
And what we witnessed yesterday was the storming of the People's House by white supremacists.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that white supremacy is not a curse word. It is a description of power distribution. And it is a description of the way in which many within the power structure would like to see the present power maintained. So that for Ted Cruz, for Josh Hawley, for the female senator from Mississippi, for most of the people who were opposing the certification of various states as they reported their electors, what's at stake is not democracy. What's at stake is who's going to be in charge. As the percentage of the white population decreases, what one has to watch for very carefully is whether or not the foundation is now being laid for minority rule, as was the case in South Africa. As more and more persons of color, by which I mean African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans of all types, persons from the Caribbean, persons coming from the African continent, as that portion of the population increases, there will be an aspiration on their part for power sharing. There's already a debate among minority groups as to, well, how many Hispanic Americans should be in Congress as opposed to African Americans. When the governor of California had to make a decision about how to replace Kamala Harris in the United States Senate, there was no discussion about appointing a white person. That was off the table. The question was, who of our various major ethnic groups are we going to name? Black women were saying it's got to be a Black woman. Black people were saying, well, it's got to be at least another Black person. But there was a massive push among Hispanics in California, who are a major part of the California political environment, to say, isn't it our turn? Isn't it our turn? And so the governor named an Hispanic person, and the world didn't come to an end. Black people did not storm the California state legislature. They did not smash out the windows of the governor's mansion, as happened in Oregon yesterday. While we were all looking at the Capitol, the same crowd of people stormed the property of the governor's mansion in Oregon. We didn't do that. We said, okay, this is about power sharing. And if our Hispanic brothers and sisters feel that they need representation, okay, we got to find a way to do this together. I wish that spirit of letting the political process work itself out peacefully could prevail in Washington and could prevail in states across the country. It's us. It's not us and them. You know, Black people have shed blood in every war this country has fought since the American Revolution, when Crispus Attucks was shot at the Battle of Boston in 1770. The soaking of his blood into the ground of this country has made us a part of the fabric of this country since the moment a British bullet pierced his body. It's our country too, and we fought for it. Let me tell you a story. Two members of my family that I discovered because somebody in my church did a genealogical study. One of them is named Elijah Alfred. Elijah Alfred was a member of the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War, fought in Company H of a regiment that was mustered out of Kentucky, which is our home state. His name is on the Civil War monument to colored soldiers, having served there and then mustered out as a sergeant in 1865. So, members of my family have fought for this country, my family, since the Civil War. In 1930, a great uncle of mine, whose name was Edward Donahue, also in Kentucky, went to register to vote at the age of 60. He was born in 1870. He dared not even think about going to register to vote in Jefferson County, Kentucky, until 1930. According to the Chicago Defender, which covered national news in those days, on December the 7th, 1930, they report that Edward Donahue was shot and killed by the registrar of voters because Edward Donahue would not leave the premises when he was told that ends, I won't use the whole word, ends cannot vote in Kentucky. Shot and killed. On December the 14th, 1930, the same Chicago Defender, they gave the registrar side of the story. He said, well, he was causing a disturbance and I felt threatened. Now, Edward Donahue was unarmed. The registrar was taken to jail, but not into custody. He pled self-defense and was released. Edward Donahue was dead. Part of my family shed blood in defense of this country. Part of my family shed blood because white people do not want to recognize our humanity. Which part of my family should I honor the most? I am both of them. I celebrate Elijah Alfred putting on the uniform. I mourn Edward Donahue, killed by someone who wished to deny him power. Now, the strange thing is, this shooting occurred on November the 8th, 1930. On November the 8th, 2008, I was a delegate for Barack Obama at the convention that nominated him. And he was elected president on the day that Edward Donahue was shot and killed. What that man was doing was trying to prevent what happened in 2008 from happening. If we kill him now, they will never become president. They lost. We're here. We're not going back.
When we come to moments like yesterday, that also reminded me of some of the darker moments in the early 60s when sorrow is the only word that could be used. John Lewis experiencing the 16th Street bombings, the death of JFK, the ongoing beatings, the death of Medgar Evers, conflict within his own organization. It is hard not to let your heart drop and stay down.
Yeah.
And I cannot watch events such as yesterday without imagining what it is like. And I would hope this is true of all people of good intention, but especially for African Americans, knowing the history of what that flag means, knowing the recent history of what mob violence can look like, how one does not feel the depths of sorrow. What do we do with that?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let you in on a little secret about living Black in America. And I'm going to take you to 9/11, when white people freaked out over a terrorist attack. Could not believe that a terrorist attack could happen in the United States. Very few Black people, had the same response. They were distraught at the destruction on the country. They were horrified by the planes flying into the buildings. What the difference was, very few of us were surprised at the thought of terror because we have been the victims of terror by the country that is now shocked that it has become the target. When you have seen lynch mobs, when you have seen cross burnings, when you have witnessed police brutality, when you have had members of your own family who have been physically brutalized, when your mother, whose last name is McMickle, answers an ad in the newspaper about a job vacancy, and she calls in to be sure that the job is available, and she says, "My name is Marthetta McMickle, in Chicago." They were certain that she was Irish. Come on down. The job is still here. And she gets down and she walks in, and Marvin McMickle is Black, and suddenly the job is no longer available. And you see that happening time after time after time. There was a member of the church that I belonged to in my youth who worked for U.S. Steel in Chicago. In those years, Chicago was a big steel town, about as big as Pittsburgh in some respects. Now, the rule was, and this was in Cicero, this is just outside of Chicago. In Cicero, the rule was Black people can drive to and from work. You're perfectly free to go work in Cicero. You just can't stop anywhere. This is in the 1960s. You cannot stop anywhere in Cicero. You got to be in a state of constant motion. He came to a red light. He was both a softball player and a pipe smoker. Well, in the 1960s, there was no inside button to open your trunk. You had to get out, pull your car over to the curb, get out, go to the back of your car, open your trunk, reach inside to get your tobacco and your pipe. I don't know why it was back there, but it was. Do you know that by the time he had gotten out of his car and to his trunk and was rummaging in his trunk, he was approached from the back by some people who lived in Cicero who did not want him there, took one of his softball bats, hit him in the head, threw him in the trunk of the car, pushed down the hood of the trunk, and left him there dead. There was no investigation. There was no arrest. There was no citywide, he shouldn't have been there. Why was he there? It was his fault. When you live with that personally, one, you're hardened so that you're not easily distraught. Two, you wonder why other folks are suddenly surprised when the true nature of the American culture is unleashed. Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and in California in the West, Asian Americans have been the victims of terrorism for 200 years in this country. In some respects, the Irish were the victims of sort of the Anglo-Franco-Germanic constituency. Jews were the victims of, sort of a Christian-based intolerance. You got to work pretty hard to find folks in this country who've never been the victims of somebody else's prejudice. So yeah, I watched that and said to myself, I've seen those faces before. I've seen that level of hatred before. I've seen that level of rage before. But it was always targeted at people of color. This time, it was targeted at the United States Capitol. And while I was shocked, I can't even imagine how the average white person feels when what they perceive to be a sacred space is desecrated by white people. I didn't see anybody Black, if there were one or two there, maybe so, but he wasn't carrying that flag. He wasn't sitting at Pelosi or at the Senate president's desk. It wasn't us doing that. How do you feel? How do you feel, America, when you see your citizens desecrating your national capital at the direction of your president? How do you feel about that? What are you going to do about that?
I can't answer for all of America, but I can certainly speak to the sickness in my own gut of the grief that that I feel, but also that I know is far heavier on others. And I wanted to think about the beloved community, but it sure was hard to get there. I wanted to think about the gift that Dr. King gave us, even if in words and deeds that we can barely live up to. But he certainly gave us words that won't go away. And we have the gift of the civil rights movement, which envisions a spiritual response to a great sin and a great systemic reality. And I hear those voices speaking in John Lewis's ear in the mid-60s saying, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. I mean, look at what's happening. Look at day in and day out. And yet I still want to hope, and I still want to believe that this is, I still want to believe that there is a way for this beloved community to have some sense of reality. And yet I also see folks who are working awfully hard to drown out the sermons, the voices. And that's kind of what it is. It's a drowning out. It's a drawing of attention, because it takes real work, and it takes real spiritual maturity to be able to talk about power in the way that you mentioned earlier, in that power is being used to keep us preserved in our memories preserved in amber, and pretend that we did not shut out the people that we did, which I understand less and less of why we do that. But I do want to ask, and maybe this is a little bit of, let's talk about the church for a moment. What are we to do as we draw these threads of history, both the hope, but also the very painful reality that this is a hard moment. And for those of us who are just waking up to what has been hard for people for many generations and centuries, that's an issue. But for those who know exactly what this is like, with the day in, day out reality, to not hear their voice heard, to not let that go to anger. I'm not sure I would not go to anger. I kind of do go to anger many times, to be frank. How do we as ministers, how do we as Christians, how do we as people of integrity and faith take the next step in building that community, and also not being, pie in the sky? Sure, it's easy to say we're the beloved community. We say it on our website. But rather to say, what does that actually ask of us? What does that actually ask of us?
I'm gonna frame my answer with Isaac Newton's first law of physics. We're at a moment where an immovable object and an irresistible force are colliding. On the one hand is the deeply entrenched reality of 245 years of American history and white predominance dug in. On the other hand is an irresistible force that is moving. Remember that on the same day that those persons stormed into and rampaged through the Capitol, in the state of Georgia, a Jewish man and an African-American man, Jewish son of immigrants and an African-American preacher who was the pastor of the church that formerly was the home of Martin Luther King Jr., were elected on the same day to the United States Senate, which changed the balance of power in the Senate, which now makes Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's job of getting their cabinet approved and at least initiating an agenda that might have been absolutely impossible under a previous arrangement. That's movement. There's no denying that movement has been happening since 1965, but there is this immovable object. At some point, they meet. They met in the election of Obama.
Mm.
They met again with the nomination of Kamala Harris. They met again with the election of Raphael Warnock. This side is going to keep moving. Period. They're going to keep moving. Disheartened on Friday night, moving again Monday morning. This side is moving. Question is, how long can this side hold out? Now, here's a quote from Dr. King. He said, segregation is dead. The only question is how costly segregationists will make the funeral. We're not going back to that. That day is done. How much do you want to pay? How long do you want to hold out? What will you do and not do before this forward movement impacts your entrenched present reality? Physics says something happens when an immovable force and an irresistible force collide. Segregation and racism is an immovable object. It is built into the country.
One does not adapt it.
Yeah, right.
It's not going to adapt. It either gets thornier or it goes.
And it's going to go as this side keeps coming. Either white America, and not all of white America, but those who are intent on preserving a certain status quo, will have to decide how far they're going to push this thing. Because they're running out of spaces. They're running out of places that it's just them any longer. It's not just them on Wall Street. There are now Black-owned investment companies. So it's not just them. It's not just them in the military. The incoming Secretary of Defense is a retired African-American 4-star general. This just keeps coming. Joe Biden is 77, 78 years old. He may only seek one term. Well, guess who's standing right behind him? An African-American, South Asian American woman who will present herself sooner or later as a candidate for the presidency unless Raphael Warnock decides to get in front of her. It is this reality that is terrifying people who are trying to hold on to a world in which only they have those kinds of options. There was a woman on the news who was quoted as saying after the election of Barack Obama, "I can't stand the thought of that Black man in that White House." Well, she forgot that White House was built by Black people who were enslaved at the time. So we got Newton. It is an irresistible force and an immovable object. And they're going to meet over and over and over again. I'm telling you now, this side, this movement side, is not going back. There's no swinging back. It is irresistible. Question is this immovable force. And that's for white folks to decide. I can't decide that for them. All I'm telling them is the side I'm swinging on is coming. It's going to keep coming. It's going to keep coming. You're going to have to decide what you're going to do. And if your only solution is to say, let's make America great again, boy, you're on the losing side of history. That's just pathetic because we're not going back to that. I mean, the Capitol is reopened today.
Capitol was reopened last night.
They went back to business that night. Yeah, you did. Yeah. What did you think you did?
Cleaned it out and got back to work.
And you're on videotape. They saw you. They're coming for you. You are in violation of half a dozen federal laws. You're going to go to prison. I hope you enjoyed sitting in that chair.
I awoke to a tweet from the one of the federal attorneys here in the area that said, "I've only got a couple weeks left, but I've got a big pot of coffee, and I'm ready for. I'm coming after everybody from Northeast Ohio who was
I
get their
heard
own
that.
picture." I
Yeah.
was,
Some folk were carrying Ohio.
amen.
They were carrying Ohio flags. How easy is it to figure out? You're walking around the Capitol carrying an Ohio flag. Oh yeah, you're going to go to jail.
Yeah. You know, and I'll draw us to a close. Your image of physics is a powerful one because when I kind of think about my own family, I kind of it's not we're aligned differently than we used to be. You know, some were Democrats, some were Republicans, and that has all shaken up. And I would say, are you in the group that is moving towards the immovable object, supportive of it, finding joy in it? And there are some, and I can understand. I see more folks who remain in that immovable position, and
Mhm.
boy, do I see pain there.
Yeah.
And there's a great tragedy of it, and maybe the greatest tragedy is that it passes pain along to people who really deserve to be free of it. And so that's an image that I'm going to hold on to. And I want to thank you for your sermon, and I want to thank you for this really rich conversation. Um, what a powerful day. Yes, sir.
One last point. I think the image translates beyond race. I think it translates into gender and sexual orientation. That nobody is free of being on the other side if they are dug in to male supremacy.
Yes.
Or hetero supremacy. So while I have always been on the side of anti-racism, the question is, am I also ready to advocate for gender inclusivity? In my profession, many African-American men who hate racism also are sexist. And many people who hate racism and hate sexism feel perfectly content to hold harsh feelings toward LGBTQ persons. So once you start feeling good about yourself on one issue, you have to ask yourself, now how far does my liberation push? I got a book coming out later this month entitled Let the Oppressed Go Free. And it tries to say you've got to keep pushing beyond the oppression that affects you and feel the oppression that affects others and be just as diligent on those as you are on your own.
What did Dr. King say? Hate is too heavy a burden to bear.
Yeah.
If you hate one person today, you got to figure out tomorrow who's next.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Good. So all of us have to hold ourselves accountable. When am I on the movement side, the progress and inclusion? And when do I find myself on the immovable side? I know members of my own profession who are immovable on women in ministry and immovable on the inclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender persons as full partners in the life of the church. But if you ask them about racism, I want freedom. Yeah, for you. I had a doctoral student named Jamie Eddy who wrote in her dissertation, if the only thing that Black men want is freedom from racism, but not freedom from the other isms, then what they want is privilege and not liberation. I've never forgotten that. You don't want liberation, you want privilege. You just want your oppression to end. But you can leave everybody else's unaddressed. I have had to grow on that myself. And thank God I've had students and colleagues who have helped to usher me into a broader, beginning with Jim Cone, I might add, usher me into a broader appreciation for what liberation looks like.
this journey of growth, that whether we think as a nation or as individual spirits, we challenge ourselves, and I'm in so much the same way as you are, which is, how do we continue to find a way to greater open our hearts and see
Yeah.
where we are? Are we on the movement side, or are we dug in?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's still all kinds of hidden ways that are hidden even to ourselves.
Yeah.
No surprise there, where we don't realize just
Yeah.
how dug in we are. And Jesus offers us all. The message is to liberate yourself
Mhm.
while liberating your sisters and your brothers.
Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the earth. That's where the Lord wants us to be.
What better way to begin the Epiphany season? So I thank you, Dr. McMickle, for your conversation and for your guidance, for your homily, and for your witness. And I look forward to more conversations as the years go by. And I give thanks for your time. Thank you so much.
It was a joy to be with you. Appreciate it.
I thank you all for joining us for this rich conversation, today's Trinity Forum with Dr. Marvin McMickle. Just as a reminder, if you haven't seen Dr. McMickle's sermon from our Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday service from yesterday, I encourage you to download that and spend a little bit of time with that. And I give thanks for your presence and for your conversation as well. As Trinity, we talk about the beloved community quite a bit. But this is one of those conversations as we look at the history and, frankly, what's going on in our world over the past few weeks, is that this is hard work, but it's holy work. And this is about a spiritual movement to which I think we're each called. So I give thanks for Dr. McMickle and for each of you. Blessings to each and every one of you, and thanks so much for watching.